In 49 BC, Rome stood on the brink of collapse. The rival armies of Caesar and Pompey were tearing the Italian peninsula apart. The economy was paralyzed, farmers abandoned their fields, cities overflowed with the unemployed, and the Mediterranean, once completely under Roman control, was now swarming with pirates to the point that grain ships from Egypt could no longer reach port. Every day, food prices rose like a death sentence hanging over the population. Merchants refused to transport goods, the rich barricaded themselves in their villas, and the poor crowded the forum waiting for the latest news from the battlefields. Rome, the capital of a republic that had once dominated half the known world, was now merely a shadow of itself, strangled by debt, violence, and a lifeless economy. But fast forward to 14 AD. Rome had not merely recovered, it had become the largest supereconomy of the ancient world. Pax Romana began. Internal wars ended. The Mediterranean turned into the safest trade route of antiquity. 400,000 kilometers of Roman roads connected over 70 million people. State revenues soared. Cities from Gaul to Judea sprang up like a modern network, and goods from Britannia, Hispania, Egypt, and Syria flooded the empire's central markets. Rome transformed from chaos to absolute prosperity in just one generation, a leap that any modern economy would envy. How did a rotten republic, torn apart by corruption, violence, and war, manage to create an economic miracle that lasted for centuries? The answer revolves around one man, Augustus, the architect of order, who did not just restore peace, but completely rebuilt Rome's political, financial, and commercial systems into a model so efficient that the entire ancient world had no rival. This was not luck. It was not fate. It was the product of sophisticated governance engineering, economic strategy, and institutional thinking so advanced that even today we still stand in awe. But to understand that spectacular economic transformation, we must go back to the starting point of the collapse. A century of chaos that turned Rome from a rising superpower into a society rotting from the root. It all began in 133 BC, when the brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus tried to save the Republic with an unprecedented land reform program. The reason was simple. Land, the foundation of Rome's agricultural economy, had fallen into the hands of a small group of wealthy landowners, while hundreds of thousands of farmers, the former backbone of both the army and production, were driven off their land, sank into debt, and drifted into already overcrowded cities. Instead of being helped, the Gracchi brothers were murdered, and the fight over land control became the first wound that marked an unprecedented social divide. What followed was a series of financial crises, farmers unable to repay debts, the state dependent on the corrupt tax collection practices of private tax farming companies, while endless wars drained the treasury dry. The city of Rome swelled with a growing proletarian mass, while the rich became ever more powerful and unchecked. It was a two-speed economy on one side, an elite profiting from plunder and colonies, on the other an unemployed populace crammed into slums. When the economy lost balance, the army lost balance too. General Marius, to solve the manpower crisis, recruited soldiers from the propertyless proletariat and paid them directly. That meant soldiers' loyalty was no longer to the state but to the general who paid their wages. Marius created the first professional army, but at the same time he unwittingly created the model of a privatized army, turning generals into mini-kings capable of seizing power by force. And that is exactly what they did. The war between Marius and Sulla was only the opening act. Then came Pompey, Crassus, Caesar, all of them relying on personal armies to grab power, plunging Rome into a repeating cycle of civil wars. The economy could not grow when resources were sucked into warfare, agriculture was abandoned, trade was disrupted, and taxes were not collected properly. The chaos ran even deeper because of one reality. The Roman economy depended heavily on slaves. After every major conquest, tens of thousands of slaves were brought back to Italy to work on farms and mines and on construction sites at almost zero cost. This completely destroyed the free labor market. Roman workers, the former backbone of the Republic, could not compete with slaves, lost their jobs, lost their income, and flooded into Rome to survive on the grain dole. An economy built on forced labor can get rich fast, but it also carries the seeds of its own destruction. It stifles the incentive to innovate and tears apart the social fabric. Meanwhile, the Mediterranean was full of pirates, paralyzing the grain transport, the lifeblood of the urban economy. The treasury empty, society fractured, the army loyal to generals rather than the state, the rich entrenched in their privileges, the poor abandoned to their fate. All of this created a stark reality. Before Rome could build the centuries-long economic miracle, it first had to endure a full century of decay, and one cannot understand the Pax Romana without understanding that it was built on the ashes of 100 years of chaos. Rome entered the final decades of the Republic, not because of a single event, but because of an economic system that had been rotting away over time, a silent yet total collapse, in which every artery of the nation became clogged at once. If the later Pax Romana operated like a smoothly running machine, the late Republic resembled a gigantic engine that had been drained of all its oil, running on grinding noises and waiting for the moment it would burst into flames. It all began with one foundational weakness. The Republic's tax system barely existed in anything like the modern sense. Instead of collecting taxes directly, the Senate outsourced tax collection to private companies, the publicani groups of wealthy businessmen who bid for the right to squeeze taxes out of each province and then extracted the maximum possible for their own profit. They did not represent Rome, they represented their own purses. The result was that the provinces were bled dry, production stalled, the population rebelled, and the flow of goods was disrupted. The state could not control its revenue, could not create a long-term budget, and could not develop a coherent economic policy. Taxes, instead of being a national resource, became the private spoils of the elite. But the problem ran even deeper. Even when taxes were collected, Rome could not make optimal use of them because the economy lacked what we today call a unified market. Each province had its own laws, its own units of measurement, its own internal taxes. Goods moving through one province paid duties, and moving into the next province meant paying again. There was no common system of weights and measures, no common quality standards, no shared infrastructure. The future empire would become a seamless commercial network, but the late republic was just a patchwork of local economies, a United States in which every state had its own currency, its own taxes, roads that didn't connect to each other, and merchants had to get permission every time they crossed a state border. In that context, maritime trade, the lifeline of Italy, was being strangled by pirates. The Mediterranean, once kept safe under Rome's control, was now swarming with Cilician pirate fleets that burned ships, took slaves, seized cargo, and attacked every shipping lane. They blocked the grain routes from Sicily and Egypt, causing food prices in Rome to skyrocket. When grain could not reach the city, the consequences were no different from a modern supply chain crisis. The poor lined up for rations, crowds grew angry, riots broke out. Merchants no longer dared to put to sea, prices of all goods rose, and the demand for security far exceeded the capacity of a state apparatus already drained by corruption. While trade weakened, agriculture went into free fall. Prolonged wars meant farmers were conscripted again and again, fields were abandoned, and when they returned, their land had already been bought up by wealthy landlords. Massive slave-worked estates. The latifundia sprang up on that foundation. In terms of cost, they were extremely efficient. Labor was almost free. Production was on a huge scale, but structurally they destroyed the entire free labor market, depriving hundreds of thousands of citizens of their livelihoods and forcing them to flood into Rome to live on handouts. Production did not innovate. Slaves had no incentive to develop new techniques. The soil was exhausted by irresponsible farming. Overall societal productivity plummeted. Rome was being bled from both sides. Wars swallowed money, trade was choked, agriculture collapsed, and the wars kept going at ever higher cost. Each new conquest brought garrison expenses, administrative expenses, the cost of suppressing revolts. With no unified tax system, no rising productivity, no common market, Rome spent like an empire, but produced like a loose alliance of separate towns. An economy like that could not withstand the pressure of a century of civil war. Rome entered an irreversible domino effect. Debt rose, production fell, poverty spread, riots erupted, politics disintegrated, more civil war. It was not a sudden crash. It was an economy being quietly suffocated day by day, year by year, until the entire system could no longer breathe. And Rome stood on the very brink of destruction. While the economy of the Republic was like a wagon with a broken axle hurtling downhill, Julius Caesar emerged as the first, and by far the boldest, attempt to reboot the entire system. Unlike the generals before him who only sought power, Caesar understood that the root of the crisis lay in the economy, a society shattered by inequality, a market paralyzed by chaotic taxation, a state bankrupted by endless wars. Therefore, when he seized power in 49 BC, he did not merely aim to defeat his enemies, he aimed to repair the rotting structure of the Republic. Caesar's first reform struck directly at the most dangerous black box, taxation. He curtailed the power of the publicani, restructured tax collection in the provinces, imposed the first recorded auditing standards in Roman history, and forced provincial governors to answer directly to the Senate rather than to private interest groups. This somewhat eased the exploitation of the provinces, the very source of revolts, and made the state budget more predictable. But fixing taxes alone was not enough. Caesar knew the economy could not function when hundreds of thousands of Roman citizens lived in proletarian misery. So he redistributed land to veterans and the poor, a move designed to restore a free peasant class, revive agricultural production, and reduce the population pressure flooding into Rome. Though not as radical as the Gracchi's ideas, this was the first time in a century that the state actually took steps to reduce social debt. And Caesar went further. He canceled a portion of private debt, not by burning the ledgers as extremists had once proposed, but by revaluing debts according to current land prices, sharing the burden between creditors and debtors, and simultaneously cutting interest rates. Whatever one thinks of him, this was clearly an attempt to break the debt, poverty, unrest spiral that had pushed the Republic to the brink of collapse. Amid stagnant production and chaotic trade, Caesar also carried out administrative reforms to create a more predictable economy. He corrected the Roman calendar, which had drifted months out of alignment, and replaced it with the Julian calendar, bringing time back into a reliable state for agriculture, taxation, and commerce. It may sound minor, but in a pre-modern economy, the calendar was the foundation of all productive activity. Caesar further expanded citizenship and granted additional legal rights to many previously excluded groups, thereby broadening the labor pool, the tax base, and the cohesion between far-flung communities in the power center in Rome. These reforms, tax, land, debt, administration, citizenship, were the first attempt in generations to rebuild Rome's economic foundation on a sustainable rather than exploitative basis. And for one brief moment, it really looked as though Rome had entered a new phase of stability. Food prices fell, riots subsided, merchants returned to the sea routes, and the provinces rebelled less often. But everything collapsed faster than anyone could realize. In 44 BC, Caesar was assassinated, and with him his entire unfinished reform program was sucked into the black hole of power struggles. The Republic was not only not saved, it was pushed deeper into civil war. Land was seized again, debts piled up again, trade froze again, and those who had once opposed Caesar now turned to look for another strongman to stabilize the country, the very thing they had feared. Caesar had seen the system's flaws, and he began to fix them with measures more radical than anyone before him. But he never got the chance to finish. What he left behind was not a fully rebuilt economy, but a blueprint, and that very blueprint would become the foundation on which Augustus built the longest-lasting economic miracle of the ancient world. Caesar fell, but the vacuum he left did not pull Rome into renewal. It plunged Rome into 2 decades of bloody civil war, even more devastating than before. Only when Octavian, later known as Augustus, stepped onto the political stage did the real process of reconstruction begin. If Caesar had tried to patch up a fracturing republic, Augustus went much further. He dismantled the entire old machine and reassembled a new system that was tighter, more stable, and more efficient than anything before it. A system that became the foundation for the longest period of prosperity the ancient world had ever seen. The first thing Augustus understood clearly was this: no economic growth can exist in chaos. In 20 years of civil war, Rome had burned through its reserves, exhausted its trade, and destroyed public confidence in the state. Where Caesar focused on fixing pieces, Augustus knew that to save Rome he had to rebuild the skeleton of the state, its institutions. The very first item in his ambitious reconstruction project was to confront the problem the Republic had failed to solve for generations: taxation. Augustus dissolved almost the entire private tax farming system of the publicani and replaced it with a tax apparatus directly controlled by the state. He imposed uniform standards of measurement, new auditing systems, and reclassified every province according to its actual tax-paying capacity. For the first time, Rome had a common fiscal state, a unified financial state where taxes were no longer the spoils of the elite, but a centralized resource of the empire. The results came quickly. The budget grew steadily, provinces rebelled less, and merchants could predict their transaction costs instead of living in fear of being fleeced by the publicani. But Augustus did not stop at taxes. He turned the army from a tool of individual generals into a tool of the state. By reorganizing the military into a professional standing force paid directly from the treasury, granting land to veterans in distant provinces, and limiting terms of service, he diffused the Republic's most dangerous explosive: armies loyal to individual commanders. When the army was loyal to the state, to policy, not to persons, civil war lost its breeding ground. The economic implications were enormous. Tens of thousands of soldiers were no longer dragged into meaningless factional wars, and the state's resources were no longer burned up in power struggles. The cost of internal security plummeted, freeing up the budget for the areas Augustus considered priorities: roads, ports, granaries, irrigation, and administration. Augustus understood something many modern leaders forget: stability is an economic policy. An economy can bear high taxes, it can bear border wars, it can bear wealth inequality, but it cannot grow in instability. When instability vanished, confidence returned, merchants invested, farmers cultivated, distant provinces paid taxes on time, and the denarius, restandardized by Augustus, became the most stable currency in the ancient world. At the same time, Augustus built a competent bureaucracy for the first time in Roman history. He established censuses, tax rolls, land classifications, production assessments, and governed provinces with trained officials instead of politicians who came to get rich during their terms. A state with data, with control, with unified taxation, and with an army loyal to policy, that was the definition of an economy capable of long-term growth. Augustus did not create the Roman miracle with a single invention. He did something much harder. He made the system run smoothly. Like a brilliant architect who first fixes the foundations, support beams, plumbing, and drainage before building the new house. Augustus rebuilt the entire state structure so that Rome for the first time became capable of generating sustainable growth instead of growth through plunder. Augustus was not just the first emperor of Rome, he was the empire's first chief economist, the man who understood that prosperity does not fall from the sky. It is the product of order, discipline, and a state that knows how to function. Pax Romana began the very moment he reset that institutional framework. All those institutional reforms of Augustus only truly unleashed their power when he deployed the single most important economic tool, the entire Roman miracle, Pax Romana, an era of peace so prolonged that contemporaries had scarcely dared to dream of it. After nearly a century of civil war, the complete end to violence between factions was not merely political, it was a positive shock to the economy. In the Old Republic, the cost of maintaining armies for rival generals and internal campaigns had devoured the bulk of the budget, choking off money for infrastructure, trade, and production. Only when Augustus brought the legions fully under state control, eliminated private armies, and stabilized the entire Italian frontier did he free up the enormous resources that had previously been burned away in civil war. Domestic military spending plummeted, and those funds were redirected toward areas capable of generating long-term economic returns: roads, granaries, ports, the tax system, and the administrative apparatus. But Pax Romana was not simply the absence of fighting. It was the beginning of an economic environment in which merchants could actually predict risk, the core requirement for any healthy market. When roads were safe, when no longer were factional armies blocking city gates, when taxes were collected steadily and laws enforced consistently, merchants returned to the sea lanes and caravans reappeared on the highways. Grain prices fell because supplies from the breadbasket provinces, Egypt, Africa, Proconsularis, and Sicily, could reach Rome regularly without being interrupted by pirates or rebel forces. In a pre-modern economy where transport costs and security risks determined almost the entirety of prices, the restoration of stable trade routes had the same effect as slamming the brakes on hyperinflation. It restored confidence in the market, revived the state's predictability, and brought prices back to levels ordinary people could afford. And once confidence returned, investment followed. That is what Augustus understood perfectly. Growth does not start with public works, does not start with military force, does not start with tax reform. It starts with stability. Pax Romana was the invisible foundation of the entire Roman economic miracle. Every one of the 7 tools that followed could only function because Augustus had created a world no longer plunged into chaos, a world where peace itself became the empire's greatest economic engine. From a stable foundation, Augustus deployed the second tool of Rome's economic miracle, turning the entire Mediterranean into a single unified common market, an unbroken economic space that humanity had never seen before. If Pax Romana was peace, then the Mediterranean common market was the economic architecture built upon that peace. Augustus's first task was to eliminate the countless internal tax barriers that had once made transporting goods between provinces expensive and complicated. Instead of each province imposing its own taxes, each city adding its own surcharges, and every route being subject to protection fees extorted by local power brokers, Augustus centralized the entire commercial tax system, standardized rates, simplified permits, and ensured that goods moving within the empire followed a single set of rules. This was the first time in world history that a free trade zone stretched from the coasts of Britain to the deserts of Syria. At the same time, he standardized commercial law, units of measurement, contract rules, transport liability, quality standards. When merchants from Hispania to Cappadocia used the same legal code, the same system of weights and measures, the same currency, and the same tax regime, transaction costs plummeted. What we today take for granted as the defaults of a common market Unified measurement, consistent commercial law, stable currency were inventions of Augustan Rome, but what made this common market actually work was not just law, it was logistics. At sea, Augustus swept the Mediterranean clean of pirates, established naval stations at Sicily, Crete, and Cilicia, and transformed the sea from a dangerous wilderness into a vast commercial highway. On land, the expanding Roman road network became the empire's transport backbone, linking ports to granaries, markets to farms, mines to consumption centers. No more separate countries, no more internal border barriers, no more fragmented local power blocks, just one unified commercial system running across continents. The ripple effects were immediate and enormous. Resource-rich provinces like Egypt, Africa, and Hispania became internal export powerhouses. Gaul and the Danube regions exported wine, timber, and livestock. Syria and Judea exported luxury goods. Everything flowed into Rome, and from Rome it spread throughout the entire economic network. This was the ancient version of lifting trade barriers plus stabilizing exports. Augustus didn't just reduce barriers, he eliminated them completely, and by turning the Mediterranean into humanity's first common market, he created the foundation for Rome to grow sustainably for centuries to come. From the common market, Augustus deployed the third tool, and perhaps the one that bore his most distinctive mark, a gigantic public investment program that transformed Rome into the empire with the most advanced infrastructure in the ancient world. If the emperor bills of Nazi Germany or FDR's New Deal once pumped blood into modern economies, Rome had its own version, but on a scale that stretched across more than just Europe. Before Augustus, Roman roads already existed, but they were fragmented, decayed, and neglected. Under him, they were expanded and standardized into a network of more than 400,000 kilometers of highways, an unbelievable figure for the ancient world. These roads were built to a uniform engineering standard: solid stone foundations, sand cushioning layers, flat stone paving, carefully calculated gradients, sturdy stone bridges, and distances marked every mile. They were not just roads, they were a transcontinental logistics system that slashed transportation costs to unprecedented lows, allowing armies to move quickly, merchants to transport goods safely, and information to travel across the empire in just days. But roads were only part of the picture. Augustus also built and expanded key ports. Ostia, Rome's gateway; Puteoli, Italy's commercial hub; Alexandria, the largest grain transport hub in the Mediterranean. These were not mere docks. They were super logistics centers with warehouses, checkpoints, naval protection, and distribution networks directly linked to the road system. Thanks to them, goods from Egypt could reach the port of Ostia, be moved into Rome within days, and then continue on to Gaul, the Rhine, or the Balkans. An economy cannot grow large without food reserves, and Augustus understood that better than anyone. He built grain warehouses on an unprecedented scale, ensuring Rome always had enough stockpiled food to survive crop failures or transport disruptions. This was the food price stabilization factor. Similar to how a modern central bank stabilizes inflation, when the reserves were full, the prices of rice, wheat, and olive oil fluctuated less, and the population was spared price shocks. At the same time, the aqueduct system was massively expanded, delivering clean water to millions of residents, a critical factor for production, sanitation, and urban health that many other civilizations lacked. All these projects, roads, ports, granaries, aqueducts, were the Roman version of a colossal state-funded public investment program, comparable to the way modern nations inject capital through bonds or central banks. They did not just create jobs, they created productivity. They did not just beautify the empire, they lowered transaction costs, accelerated transport speeds, and unlocked a truly large-scale economy. The result was trade that became cheaper, faster, and safer. And in an ancient economy where transportation made up the bulk of costs, that was equivalent to sustainable growth. Augustus did not need to print money. He built infrastructure, and that infrastructure became the multiplier that detonated the entire Roman economy's output for centuries afterward. From its colossal infrastructure, Augustus deployed the fourth tool, a silent but decisive economic engine: industrial-scale resource extraction across the entire territory of the empire. Unlike many ancient economies that depended on merchants or imported raw materials, Rome chose a completely proactive path, directly owning, exploiting, and controlling the most strategic resources of the ancient world. This created an advantage that no rival in the region could match. The heart of the Roman mining system was the Iberian Peninsula, Hispania, where enormous reserves of gold and silver turned the region into the empire's natural treasury. Under Augustus, Rome worked mines like Las Medulas, using extremely advanced hydraulic technology called ruinomontium, in which water was channeled through tunnel and aqueduct networks, dozens of kilometers long to generate pressure that collapsed entire mountainsides. This was true industrial mining, driven by engineering rather than just human labor. The gold and silver obtained from Hispania provided a stable financial base to pay the army, build public works, and run the enormous administrative apparatus that stretched across 3 continents. Meanwhile, Gaul became the empire's metallurgical workshop. The huge iron deposits there were mined, refined, and transported via the Roman road system to production centers. Gaulish iron became the raw material for weapons, agricultural tools, road nails, construction equipment, and every type of gear needed for Rome's expansion and stability. Without this iron supply, Rome could never have built its 400,000-kilometer road network or uniformly equipped the largest professional army in the ancient world. Farther north, Britain supplied tin and lead, 2 essential materials for alloy production, tool-making, infrastructure, and aqueduct systems. The Romans used British lead to build large-scale water pipes that delivered clean water to densely populated cities, an important factor in sustaining urban growth and economic productivity. All these resources, gold, silver, iron, tin, lead, when linked to the ports, roads, and warehouses that Augustus had built, formed a complete supply chain: mine, port, road, workshop, market, army. Thanks to direct control of strategic raw materials, Rome was not dependent on imports or foreign merchants. The empire was largely self-sufficient in the resources its economy required, and for that reason it was able to maintain stable growth for centuries. This was not just mining, it was a resource machine powered by engineering, organization, and state power. From the resource machine, Augustus deployed the 5th tool, one that seemed purely technical but completely transformed how the Roman economy operated: the standardization of currency, or what can be called the revolution of the denarius. Before Augustus, currency in the Roman world was a chaotic mess. Old city-states, conquered provinces, generals, and even local power groups could all mint their own coins. The silver content was unstable, values varied by region, and merchants had to constantly exchange money as they traveled. This turned every transaction into a gamble, raised the cost of trade, slowed the circulation of goods, and undermined trust in contracts. Augustus cut through all that chaos with one simple yet far-reaching move. He standardized the denarius as the primary currency unit, imposed a fixed silver content, and brought coin minting under tight state control. When a silver coin from Syria was worth exactly the same as one from Gaul or Italy, merchants no longer had to worry about fraud, devaluation, or measurement differences. Transaction costs dropped immediately, like a modern country controlling inflation and stabilizing exchange rates. Stable money didn't just help trade, it created trust, that invisible asset that holds every lasting economy together. When the value of money stopped swinging wildly, people saved more, merchants signed longer-term contracts, and the state could collect taxes more efficiently because calculations became consistent. A unified currency also created a kind of financial unity among tens of millions of people from dozens of ethnicities, languages, and cultural regions. A farmer in Judea, a craftsman in Thessaly, and a merchant in Lugdunum could now trade using the exact same unit of value, and when money became a common language, the market became a common system. This was the ancient version of monetary stability, a prerequisite for growth that every modern economy takes for granted. With the denarius, Augustus didn't just create a coin, he created a single integrated economic space where value flowed smoothly from Western Europe to the Middle East. From a stable monetary foundation, Augustus activated the 6th instrument of the Roman miracle: large-scale urbanization and the rise of consumer cities, gigantic consumption cities that created the strongest domestic demand in the ancient world. If infrastructure, currency, and a common market generated the flow of goods, then the cities were where that flow was absorbed, redistributed, and turned into real growth. At the center of this system was Rome, the first city in history to reach 1 million inhabitants. No place in the ancient world, from China to Persia, possessed an urban center with such population size and level of consumption. Rome was a colossal supermarket, the central marketplace, the place where every type of goods from across the empire was brought to satisfy the nearly limitless demand of its urban population. Grain from Egypt, olive oil from Hispania, wine from Gaul, luxury goods from Syria and Arabia. Alongside Rome, cities like Alexandria, Antioch, Corinth, and Carthage became regional consumption hubs, each functioning as a trade center linking the provinces to the empire-wide market. These cities did not merely consume, they generated demand, and that demand pushed the entire imperial economy forward. When millions of people concentrated in urban areas, demand for food, consumer goods, building materials, and services skyrocketed, creating a massive domestic market that no other civilization could match. This was like an ancient version of demand stimulation, but without triggering inflation, because Rome had the two elements every consumer economy needs: enormous resource supplies and powerful transportation infrastructure. The Romans ensured a steady food supply to Rome by maintaining the Annona program, subsidized grain distribution to urban residents. This prevented sudden food price spikes, avoided supply shocks, and stabilized daily life. On a broader scale, it also prevented widespread inflation, because when food, the largest cost of living, was kept under control, prices of other goods fluctuated less. Thanks to logistics infrastructure, a unified currency, and abundant resources, demand could surge while supply kept pace. The result was that Rome created an economic space capable of increasing demand without increasing prices, a rare achievement in ancient history. Urbanization did not just enrich Rome, it enriched the entire system. And when domestic demand grew large enough to absorb the output of dozens of provinces, the Roman Empire entered a phase of self-sustaining growth, something Augustus fully understood when he transformed the cities into the central pillars of the imperial economy. From the consumer demand generated by the cities, Augustus deployed the seventh tool, a decisive institutional pillar for the sustainability of the entire Roman economic miracle: provincial tax reform and the construction of a unified fiscal state. If previously taxes had been revenue that leaked away through the hands of interest groups, under Augustus, they became the centralized lifeblood of the empire, controlled through administrative discipline and data rather than the greed of private contractors. The first thing Augustus did was eliminate the power of the publicani, the private tax farming companies that had once ruthlessly exploited provincial residents to maximize profits. By replacing them with a direct tax system managed by the state, he severed the toxic financial relationship between certain wealthy families in Rome and the provinces, paving the way for a fairer, more predictable tax model. Provincial populations no longer faced arbitrary tax rates or extortionate extra fees. This change reduced rebellions, boosted local production, and made trade more stable. But the reform did not stop at simply eliminating corruption. Augustus also established a system for assessing the productive capacity of each province, from land, population, agricultural output to commerce and mining, in order to allocate taxes rationally. This was the ancient version of apportionment based on economic capacity. Richer provinces contributed more, poorer ones less, and everything operated within a predictable structure. As a result, the empire's budget became stable, transparent, and capable of long-term planning. When the state knew exactly how much it would collect, and collected it accurately and consistently, it could invest in infrastructure, the army, grain reserves, and the administrative apparatus without having to rely on war or plunder as in previous periods. This financial stability also increased merchant confidence. When taxes were transparent, they invested more, expanded transportation, and built new workshops. This was Roman-style fiscal centralization, the transformation from a fragmented republic into an empire with a modern, highly organized financial system far ahead of its time. And it was precisely this centralized tax model that allowed Rome to sustain growth for centuries, while other civilizations were strangled by arbitrary, corrupt local tax systems. From the foundation of centralized finance, Augustus activated the eighth tool, the most controversial, most effective, and also the most dangerous one in the entire Roman economic model: controlled territorial expansion and the exploitation of slave labor as a growth engine. In the ancient world, where labor productivity was almost stagnant and technology advanced slowly, conquest was one of the few ways to generate large-scale growth. Every new territory Rome seized did not just bring military victory. It delivered fresh resources: gold and silver mines, fertile farmland, strategic trade routes, natural harbors, and tens of thousands of slaves. The cheap labor force that powered the entire economic machine. Slaves became the raw energy of the system. They worked the massive latifundia estates in Sicily and Africa, mined silver in Hispania and Britain, built roads, dug canals, operated smelters, and performed every heavy task the economy required. A landowner with hundreds of slaves could produce the amount of grain that previously required hundreds of free farmers. A silver mine worked by forced labor could run non-stop, supplying metal for coinage and the treasury. That is why Roman goods were cheap, output was abundant, and cities could grow to sizes unprecedented in history. But the system always carried a price. Forced labor gave owners no incentive to invest in technology or improve tools. Why invent machines when human power was almost free? This capped the empire's long-term productivity. And when conquests slowed under the emperors who followed Augustus, the supply of new slaves began to dry up, causing the whole model to falter. Worse still, every new territory Rome took extended the frontiers, meaning defense costs soared. While the Pax Romana reduced civil wars, the pressure to hold the borders created ever-rising military expenses. This was the paradox of Roman prosperity. Expansion created growth, but overexpansion weakened the empire. The model propelled Rome to the pinnacle faster than any contemporary civilization, yet it also planted the seeds that made it impossible for the empire to sustain that pace forever. What Augustus built, peace, a common market, massive infrastructure, industrial-scale mining, unified currency, urbanization, tax reform, and territorial expansion, was not magic. It was a deliberately designed system, driven by sophisticated institutional thinking and coordinated like a modern machine. Rome prospered for centuries because it was constructed in a way very few ancient civilizations ever thought to attempt. But right beneath the surface of that order and prosperity, the Roman economic model carried hidden costs that Augustus could not eliminate, small cracks at first, but ones that would widen over time and shake the very foundation of the miracle he had created. The first and most obvious weakness was the very source of energy that had allowed Rome to grow so rapidly: slave labor. When hundreds of thousands of slaves were brought back from Gaul, Hispania, Judea, or Thrace, production costs in Rome fell to unimaginable lows, but that cheapness came at a price. It strangled any incentive for technological innovation. Why would a landowner invest in machinery or new techniques when he could simply buy 50 more slaves? Why would a metalworking shop improve its processes when it could just add 100 more forced laborers? The Romans were not stupid, they understood innovation. Yet, an economic system dominated by dirt-cheap labor would never generate incentives for long-term investment. And that meant Roman productivity, despite the empire's vast scale, remained virtually stagnant for centuries. Agriculture also carried a silent burden: ever heavier land rents. The remaining free farmers had to pay taxes, pay rent, and compete with gigantic slave-worked estates, driving them into a downward spiral of exhaustion. When farmers lost their land, they drifted to the cities to claim welfare, further increasing the financial burden on the state. The distant provinces, Gaul, Egypt, Syria, Africa, were the true engines of production for the empire. Yet most of what they produced was sucked toward Rome, where a colossal consumer demand swallowed the output of dozens of regions. Augustus's centralized tax system created stability across the empire, but it also meant the provinces were drained beyond what was necessary to feed the administrative machine and the grand projects in the capital. A farmer in Egypt or a frontier guard in Syria might work an entire year only to see most of his earnings shipped off to feed Rome's population, people who received subsidized grain and enjoyed monuments that the provinces never even got to see. And because infrastructure, granaries, currency, and markets all operated toward the center, Rome became a gigantic resource magnet, an economic black hole that pulled wealth from the provinces into the capital instead of distributing it the other way. The provinces might be rich in resources, but Rome was the one that enjoyed them. The more efficiently the system worked, the deeper that asymmetry became. Finally, the empire relied far too much on growth through conquest. Each new territory, each new army kept the flow of resources and slaves streaming toward the center. The model worked brilliantly while Rome was still expanding, when there was more Gaul, more Britain, more Egypt to take. But once the frontiers reached areas that were resource-poor or too difficult to conquer, the growth model began to slow. And when expansion slowed, the entire structure of prosperity, which had been built on conquest, came under strain. Defense costs rose, the supply of slaves dried up, while Rome's demands remained unchanged. That was the core contradiction. The more prosperous Rome became, the more resources it needed to sustain that prosperity. Yet when there were no new lands left to conquer, that prosperity began to eat away at its own foundations. This was the dark side of the Roman miracle, an extraordinary model of organization, engineering, and vision, but also a model of inequality, exploitation, and one that could not sustain itself forever. It delivered prosperity to the center, but placed the burden on the provinces. It built cities unlike any the world had seen, yet exhausted farmers and slaves. It created stability, but depended on war to feed that stability. And beneath all the solid stone monuments that Augustus left behind, the first cracks had already begun to appear. Those cracks initially lurked just beneath the surface. But as the 1st and 2nd centuries AD passed, they began to swell into limits that even a system as flawless as Augustus's could not overcome. Rome hit the ceiling of agricultural productivity, the inherent weakness of every pre-industrial economy. No matter how perfect the infrastructure, no matter how smoothly the common market operated, grain yield per hectare could barely increase when plowing, irrigation, and storage technology remained almost the same as in the Republic era. Large-scale slave estates operated efficiently, but that efficiency could not grow further if the tools stayed the same, and human muscle remained the foundation. When urban demand kept rising, but output failed to keep pace, the system began to experience small tremors. At the same time, the Roman population grew very slowly, contrary to what one would expect from a prosperous empire. Slaves were not encouraged to reproduce. Many regions devastated by wars before Augustus's time had still not fully recovered, and plagues spread more widely than ever along the new trade routes. An economy based on forced labor and tenant farmers could not produce a population boom. The empire's body was strong, but its inner pulse was weak. Meanwhile, border costs rose rapidly over time. As Rome expanded from the Rhine to the Danube, from Britain to Syria, the frontier became so long that no budget could fully defend it without constantly increasing military spending. What Augustus had built to reduce civil war was now replaced by the burden of external defense. Every year the empire had to pay salaries and supplies for more than 25-30 legions stationed along the borders, a cost that became unbearable the moment economic growth slowed even slightly. And when wars broke out against Parthia, Dacia, the Germanic tribes, or nomadic peoples, Rome had to spend enormous additional sums just to maintain the balance of power. The wars of Augustus's time were carefully controlled. After him, many emperors chose to use war to leave a personal mark or to paper over political instability. Continuous warfare began to erode the treasury, and every mobilization of the army meant reserves of grain were depleted, roads were damaged, and the central treasury had to drain resources from the provinces to cover the shortfall. But perhaps the greatest limitation of the model was the one Augustus feared most. His successors lacked the ability to maintain the sophistication of the system. Tiberius was overly cautious and paranoid. Caligula was chaotic and extravagantly wasteful. Nero burned away trust with terror politics. Domitian centralized power to the point of paralyzing local initiative. Commodus turned the entire empire into a stage for his own whims. A model as refined as Augustus's required stability, financial discipline, quality control of officials, and long-term vision. Yet a succession system based on family ties or palace intrigue could not guarantee that. As a result, the perfect circle that Augustus had drawn, peace, market, infrastructure, production, taxes, stability, began to turn more slowly. Every incompetent emperor weakened one link. Every pointless rebellion or meaningless war undermined one pillar. Every year, the borders cost more, stretched the treasury tighter. And then in the 3rd century, the model finally hit the wall. Borders too long, costs too high, not enough slaves, soil exhausted, plagues raging, population declining, and the state apparatus grown bloated. The Roman miracle did not collapse in a single day. It gradually lost momentum. Not because the design was bad, but because no one was capable of keeping that machine running at the speed Augustus had once achieved. The limitations of the model became increasingly evident as the empire entered the 3rd century, a period history calls the crisis of the 3rd century, a slow-burning, multi-layered crisis that devastated far more deeply than any single battle. Once the Roman miracle was no longer fueled by territorial expansion, the entire system began to consume itself. The currency crisis struck first. As the treasury emptied due to skyrocketing military costs and ever-expanding borders, emperors were forced to debase the denarius, reducing its silver content so more coins could be minted. A silver coin that had once been a symbol of trust under Augustus now became cheap white metal. In just a few decades, the silver content of the denarius plummeted from over 90% to under 5%. The result was nothing less than an ancient hyperinflation. Prices soared. Merchants refused to accept imperial coinage. Trade reverted to barter and trust. The very foundation of the entire miracle crumbled piece by piece. But currency was only a symptom. Plague delivered another fatal blow. The plague of Cyprian swept through the empire from 249 to 262, killing millions in many places, wiping out 30–40% of the population. With the population collapsing so abruptly, agriculture stalled, tax revenue plunged, and the army faced severe manpower shortages. An empire that had once relied on urbanization and domestic demand now watched its cities empty, workshops close, and food grow scarce. The third blow came from within the political system itself. Imperial civil wars, known as the era of the barracks emperors. From 235 to 284, Rome had more than 20 emperors, most of them overthrown or assassinated by the army. Each legion proclaimed its own general as emperor, turning the throne into war booty. The army, once the tool that protected the borders, became the political force that decided the empire's fate. And to buy the soldiers' loyalty, every new emperor raised pay, handed out bonuses, and granted land, driving the already bankrupt treasury even deeper into ruin. At the same time, trade collapsed. Pirates reappeared in the Mediterranean, merchants refused to ship goods through regions controlled by rebels, and the once perfectly maintained roads of Augustus's day were abandoned, bridges fell into disrepair, and no one fixed them. When trade declined, producing provinces like Egypt, Africa, and Hispania lost their markets. When supply chains broke, major cities faced food shortages. The supply network that Augustus had designed like a perfectly synchronized machine now became a fragmented web that only kept running thanks to local improvisation. And the deepest root cause of all these breakdowns was the one Augustus himself had long foreseen. The growth model based on conquest no longer worked. There were no more resource-rich frontiers to expand into, no fresh supply of slaves to feed production, no victories to fill the treasury. An economic engine built to run on war spoils now had to depend entirely on taxation and domestic production, both of which had already hit their productivity ceilings. When the fuel ran out, the Roman miracle did not explode or collapse overnight. It gradually ground to a halt, like a massive chariot that loses momentum, rolls a few more turns, then stops dead. The crisis of the 3rd century was not a sudden event. It was the inevitable outcome when a model of prosperity was pushed beyond its natural limits. Rome did not fall in war. Rome fell in peacetime, when the very mechanisms that had once created prosperity no longer had room to function. And when we look back at that entire journey, from the spectacular rise under Augustus to the gradual stagnation of the 3rd century, we realize that the Roman miracle was not just a story of the past. It is a complete economic model, with advantages, weaknesses, growth cycles, saturation points, and natural limits, things that any modern economy, especially the United States, can hold up as a mirror. The first lesson Rome sends to the future is this: political stability is not the result of economics. It is the single most important economic policy. Without the Pax Romana, there would have been no long-distance trade, no million-person cities, no common market. Every growth model needs a predictable political foundation, something modern democracies sometimes take for granted. When internal conflict rises, trust falls, businesses pull capital, and the economy strangles itself. Augustus understood this better than anyone. He ended the civil wars not out of morality, but out of economics. The second lesson: infrastructure is the most powerful productivity multiplier humans have ever created. The roads that linked the Rhine to the Danube, the ports that connected Egypt to Rome, the granaries and aqueducts, all of them produced an economic multiplier effect that Rome relied on for centuries. The United States has had its own such eras: the interstate highways, the logistics system, the internet, energy. But like Rome after Augustus, if infrastructure investment slows, productivity cannot keep pace with the demands of a giant economy. Without new roads, you cannot have new growth. The third lesson: a common market creates productivity that no single policy can achieve on its own. Rome became a super economy not because it produced more in each individual region, but because it removed the friction between regions. When goods moved freely, laws were uniform, currency was stable, supply chains became one single flow. That is the principle behind the EU, NAFTA, or the US internal market. When markets are fragmented by politics, taxes, protectionism, or cultural conflict, productivity drops immediately. Rome proved it. Openness creates prosperity. Fragmentation creates stagnation. But perhaps the most important lesson, and the one that forces us to pause and reflect, is this: every miracle has limits, if it depends on expansion. The Roman Empire did not collapse because of war. It collapsed because its machine required more territory than the world could provide. When expansion slowed, the economic model hit its ceiling, and every weakness accumulated in the system began to surface: currency crises, pandemics, civil wars, collapsing trade. In the modern world, territorial expansion no longer means conquering land, but it takes the form of credit expansion, public debt expansion, global supply chain expansion, consumption expansion based on future expectations. And just like Rome, any model that relies too heavily on expansive growth without addressing core productivity will sooner or later hit its ceiling. Every miracle has its rhythm. Every prosperity has its saturation point. No economy grows indefinitely. Rome is the reminder that even an empire that was perfectly organized, resource-rich, militarily dominant, and institutionally superior will still reach its own limits if its growth model is not adjusted to new realities. That is the message for any superpower that wants to sustain its strength. Learn to maintain productivity instead of just expanding. Learn to reinforce infrastructure instead of resting on past glory. Learn to preserve stability instead of feeding conflict. Because, as Rome has shown, history shows the curve. Empire shows the ceiling. If the journey of Rome teaches us anything, it's the cold truth that every great economy is built on technology, discipline, and choices, but is ultimately shaped by its own limitations. The rise of Rome was not accidental, and Rome's stagnation was no mystery. The curve was drawn from Augustus to the 3rd century. Growth, saturation, pressure, then fracture, and that curve does not belong only to the past. It is the pattern for every superpower in every era. If you want to understand the future of the United States, look at the curve Rome traveled, how it climbed, how it hit its ceiling, and how internal decisions shaped its fate more than any external enemy ever could. History does not repeat itself, but it leaves a shape behind, and that shape is clear enough for anyone willing to look at it straight on. If you want to follow more economic history stories like this, subscribe. We have many more curves left to decode.